Hi, so this lecture is going to talk about basically resources and economics. And the reason why this is important and we talk about it is because when we look at policy, there's always economics behind policy, right? It's always about who's going to come out the winner in terms of making money, who's not, who we're supporting. And so there is economic value within just policy in general. But obviously, also, a lot of times we're going to look at the cost of things because that's going to make a difference to whether we're going to look for something else or use the same type of material. And so we talk about it here at the beginning because we'll see this thread kind of the whole way through the semester that money matters. And I'm sure you know this just from life in general. In some cases, it's less important. However, there's usually always a monetary factor. Even when we're going to talk about food waste, if we're not looking from a conservation point in terms of the environment, we can always come back to the economics of it as well. All right, so let's define economics first. As always, we have a few definitions we could look at. It could be the careful management of wealth or resources, how the world makes a living, or more specifically, how resources, which would include things like land, labor, and capital, are used to produce goods and services to meet human wants. A study of the choice and decision-making of the world with limited resources. The branch of social sciences concerned primarily with analyzing or explaining human behavior and making decisions. What we know is that basically economists try to study the complex ways in which we're working within society. So a lot of times there's a study of goods and services and in what amounts, and we'll talk about supply and demand a little bit later. What means are these goods and services being produced? So what kind of combinations are we using? Are there substitutes that are cheaper? Can we keep the bottom line in terms of a manufacturing done? What's the markup? What could it be? Those types of things. And then how are goods and services produced to be distributed among individual members and groups of societies and population? Now, if you are familiar with economics, and some of you may come from a background like business or even in high schools now they offer economics. Some of you may not have had very much experience with economics, which is totally fine. Everything you need to know, you're going to hear about in this lecture. But there are definitely different types of economics and different ways of looking at things, and we're going to look at a few of them. So the first is basic neoclassic economics, and neoclassic economics focuses on supply and demand, and they use supply and demand as the driving force behind production, pricing, and consumption of goods and services. So with supply and demand, we have resource inputs. Those include the actual money you have to put into it, human capital, so this could include things like labor, and then natural capital. So that could be materials if you are making something that's a natural product or has a natural base to it. We also have something called rational choice theory, and this uses a model to look at human decision making. Most of the time, what we find is that you live in line with your personal preferences. A lot of times consumers are going to be maximizing utility. We want the greatest value for what you're spending your money on or your time on. And then producers maximize profit when they are looking at, let's make as much money as possible. So they're looking at, a lot of times, what's the least amount of money we can invest in making it, and what's the most amount of money we can get from selling it. We also have normative and positive economics, as well as behavioral. Normative economics is going to reflect opinion-oriented, prescriptive value judgment, or what should be statements aimed towards economic development. Its goal is to summarize people's desirability, or lack thereof in some cases, to various economic development situations or programs. Normative economics involves feelings. A lot of times they'll say that it's a little more out of the box thinking. Positive economics, on the other side, focuses on the description, quantification, and explanation of economic developments and expectations. It's very objective, fact-based. We get descriptive statements, and it looks more at cause and effect. Behavioral economics applies psychological insights into economic decisions and in the decision-making process. What we can do is use Economic policies is a tool for affecting social change and put environmental costs back into the equation. And so we're going to talk about goods and services here on the next few slides. But one thing we're going to start to look at is, can we put a value on the environment? And in some cases, just like we argued with intrinsic versus instrumental, with intrinsic, right, sometimes there's not a value to it, or you can't describe the value, and sort of put a number on it becomes very, very difficult. So we're going to kind of work our way through this as we look at some other things. All right, so when we look at goods, a good is any object or product. A commodity is a kind of good, and we can label them in a couple of different manners. A rivalrous good means that consumption by one prevents simultaneous consumption by another. So think of this as your personal property, okay? Your laptop is a rivalrous good. If you are using it, no one else can be using it unless, you know, you're sitting in front of you and you're watching a movie together in that situation. But if you are physically using it, like typing on it, we'll say, it's really difficult for anyone else to be using it, right? Non-rivalrous means that the cost of providing it to an additional individual is zero. So think of TV broadcasting or going to the movies. Once you go to the movie, in that movie theater, no matter how many people fill those seats, the movie theater does not pay more or less for that movie to show you, right? You're paying to get in it, but that's where they're making the profit. They don't, if they have one person in the audience or 20 people in the audience, they paid the same amount of money, however much that cost them, to get the rights to show that movie. So that is a non-rivalrous good. Excludable goods are goods where you can keep people that have not paid for it from having access. So theoretically, streaming services, if people didn't share their passwords, a toll road, theoretically, right? If you don't pay for it, you're going to get a ticket. You can use it for a little bit of time, but you're going to get a ticket. So there's situations, it's not as cut and dry as some other things, but there are situations, and theoretically, where we should have excludable goods, but there's workarounds. A non-excludable good, it means that non-paying customers cannot be prevented from having it. So here's a really great example. You don't have to live in Milwaukee County to go to a Milwaukee County public park. You don't have to live in Milwaukee County to go to the beach. Unless you attend a private beach, you can travel anywhere, right, and go to the beach without paying for it, even if you don't live there. And the reason why this becomes important is because a lot of times things like taxes that we pay for living in a particular area go to help maintaining those parks. So if you live in Milwaukee County and you pay taxes, part of your taxing money goes to maintaining the parks or hiring people to help maintain the parks, right? But I don't live in Milwaukee County, I live in Waukesha County. I can come and use a public park and my taxes are not going to that, so I'm using it for free, but they can't be like, oh, you can't go there because you don't live here. So there are some ways that we can define our goods, and we're going to talk about private goods and public goods here on the next slide. So as we categorize these, we're going to start to see that we have different reactions to them as we move through history again. And so as we get to next week and we start talking about history, we're going to see how private goods become more important to us and really how they became more important and really a part of the American way of thinking these days and how it kind of got rooted. Here we have this nice little table that kind of gives you some examples of rivalrous and non-rivalrous in our column, and then our first column, and then excludable and non-excludable then in our other two columns. We can also look at public versus private goods. Public goods are non-rivalrous, meaning you using them doesn't stop anybody else from using it, and non-excludable. So a public park is a great example of a public good. And so if you go the non-rivalrous row and the non-excludable column, you see public park. Air is also important, right? No one owns the air. So we talk about air quality, this kind of becomes a little bit of an issue, okay? If we look at a private good, it is rivalrous. You can stop someone else from using it because you are using it. And it's excludable because you can stop someone from using it if they don't pay. And so here we have stuff you own, right? Realistically, that is 100% a private good. Notice that a non-rivalrous good that's excludable are things like movie theaters, right? So really, you shouldn't be able to get into a movie without paying for it, okay? And I realize this is all a technical discussion because I know a lot of people that movie hop, but theoretically you should only be paying for one movie, going to that movie and seeing it. It's not costing the movie theater anymore, as we said, depending on how many people are watching it, and really you shouldn't be able to get in if you don't pay, okay? If we look at rivalrous goods that are non-excludable, we're looking at things like fish stocks and forests as well. So if you take fish from a fish stock, no one else can use it, right? Okay, and so that's where we get the rivalrous part of that. We also have something called a common property resource, and that's that example I just talked about, the fish stocks and the forest, where it is going to be typically owned and managed collectively by a community rather than individuals. And then a common pool resource is when we have problems of congestion, overuse, destruction. We will look at this idea when you start reading, and if you haven't started reading it, it's our first in-depth assignment, The Tragedy of the Commons, and how people are going to behave in that manner. We have some social economic models that you may be familiar with, and we're going to look at capitalism versus communism. Okay, so capitalism is an economic system in which capital is mostly owned by private individuals and corporations. It's considered to have a free market economy, again, based on supply and demand. We have resources that are allocated based on shifting values and wants market. We have a freedom of choice, so we can pick whatever brand we want. We're not necessarily pushed towards one brand or only given one option. And typically within a capitalist society, we have laissez-faire capitalism, a belief that economies and businesses function best when there's no interference by the government. One of the guiding principles of capitalism is a free market economy. We want minimum interference with the government in a capitalistic society. Communism, on the other hand, replaces private property and a profit-based economy with public ownership and communal control of at least the major means of production and natural resources in society. Typically, this means that the government represents this group and owns things. It's an economic system in which capital is owned by society as a whole and then is represented by a government. Allocations of resources is typically controlled by the state. There tends to be an equality of benefits as well within communism. And so in some cases, we're looking at, you would be given one option of, I don't know, whatever you want to buy, the salad dressing, and you would have to buy that brand because that's what it would be there. In a capitalistic society, we have all the brands of salad dressing and you can buy whatever kind you want. Market failures and inefficiency. So a market failure is when the allocation of goods and services by a free market is not efficient. Okay? A lot of times a public good falls into this category because the producer cannot limit its consumption to paying customers. Okay? Market inefficiencies are when an asset's market price do not always accurately reflect its true value. So this could be two options. One, it's too expensive, or it's just something people don't get on board with and so they don't buy it. We've all been to a store where you go to the sales section and there's like one or two t-shirts and there's like 50,000 of them because for whatever reason nobody was on board with it and so it didn't sell at full price, so they have to mark it down to sale. Okay. There's also things where we look at it and we think that it's great, but it's not worth what we think they're charging it, and so we don't buy it. And that would also be a market inefficiency. A monopolistic government is a firm who is the sole seller of a product and there are no close substitutes. So we can look at some examples like De Beers with diamonds, Microsoft with Windows, or you can also have this if you have a company that has strong brand loyalty. It's not necessarily a monopoly, but it almost acts that way for a personal level for a person. Okay, so you probably know if you are particularly brand loyal, and usually it's in one or two aspects of your life. It may not be something that's across brand. So if you think of running shoes, right, there are so many companies that have their own running shoes, right? New Balance, Reebok, Nike, Saucony, there's thousands. Go into a shoe store when you get the opportunity, or Google it, and you'll see them. I am very particular to Nike shoes. I don't try on other shoes. I just wear those. And so for me, that's what I wear, and I don't care that there's all these other options. I don't even think about those other options when I go in to buy a new pair of shoes. I just go with what I know. And so in that case, for me, I'm creating a monopoly myself because I'm only shopping that particular brand. Okay. An oligopolistic, oh my goodness, every time I go to read this and say this word, it always comes out crazy. Oligopolistic, I'm so sorry, market is a market structure containing a small number of relatively large firms with significant barriers to entry of other firms. So a great example of this is looking at cell phone carriers. We have a few options, but most of the time we only go for the big options. So we have Verizon, T-Mobile, AT&T, and Sprint. Those are probably the most well-known cell phone companies. There are, in fact, maybe to your knowledge or not to your knowledge, a lot of other smaller things like Boost Mobile. That's really the only one I can think of. TracFone maybe still exists. Oh, I might have just really aged myself. And so even though there's options there, there's 4 big categories. And so we see that there's some options, but we're not necessarily representing all of the options based on our choices there. Okay. If we look at free trade, we know that allows us to have any kind of option that we want within this. So we can have these monopolies form, and while they're not supposed to be there, they're still existing in a way. All right, externalities. This is a huge vocabulary word, subject that we will come back to with every discussion pretty much. Okay, so an externality can be both positive and negative. It's basically a side effect or consequence of anything, but in our cases, we're looking at industrial or commercial activity that affects other parties without this being reflected in the cost of the good or service. So an example, an oil refinery is established adjacent to a residential neighborhood. Positives are it might get some jobs for that local area. Negatives would be the people that live nearby are going to deal with potentially extra noise pollution, maybe light pollution depending on when they're working. The water system could get tainted through the results of the mining process and the refinement process. And so we have these side effects that we don't necessarily make up for in the cost of the product itself, okay? But like I said, there can be positives and there can be negatives, okay? Social cost are the total cost of economic activity, both the individual and the spillover effect on third parties. So when we look at social costs, we're typically looking at the private cost of a company plus any externalities. And we're going to talk about how some of these externalities actually get added into our cost. And so in class, when I talk about this, typically a question I ask people is what is one positive externality and one negative externality for the Democratic National Convention coming to Milwaukee? Now things have changed and that's still up in the air, it seems, from what I last read, which was a while ago. But a lot of people will say, and reason why cities host big things like this, because it brings a lot of people in, it brings a lot of money into the city because people are going to restaurants and hotels and bars and parks and doing, museums, all that kind of stuff that you do when you visit a place. But if we all lived on the east side or downtown, things we would notice, all of a sudden there's going to be a lot of people that aren't typically there. There's probably going to be more traffic. Sometimes you're even going to see things like the cost of a plane ticket go up during that particular time. Hotel rooms are certainly going to get more expensive during that time period. So we have both positives and negatives, and we can see this, like I said, with anything. We're going to focus in, obviously, on the environment, so things like air pollution, water pollution, when we're looking at negative externalities. We have something called the free rider problem, and we have this everywhere. But we're going to look at it environmentally speaking. So a free rider is a type of market failure that occurs when those who benefit from resources, public goods, or services of a communal nature do not pay for them. It's a problem because they're not paying for a good, but they have access to it. Another way of thinking about it is the inclination to enjoy a benefit of a good without paying or paying a competitive price for it. I feel like a good example of this is Wikipedia, though I am always surprised when I ask this in class, how many people actually donate to Wikipedia? Because if you go on a couple different, if you're on a Wikipedia spree, right, at some point, it's like however many page views you have, then it starts asking you, like, will you donate $1? And like I said, I've always had more people than I expect pay, but that's kind of an example of a free rider program. Another thing is when we talked about the sharing of passwords for things like Netflix and Amazon Prime or Hulu or whatever, Disney Plus, whatever it may be, you're sharing, and so somebody is getting that subscription without paying for it. Okay. When we look at environmental polluters, if we look at the example of an oil spill, if the company that caused the spill or is responsible for the spill doesn't pay for the full cost to clean up the spill, then we have a free rider problem, because a lot of times we're not just going to say, oh, they're not paying for all of it, we're only going to clean up for as much as they pay for. Someone will step in and clean up the rest of it, and so essentially they're being a free rider at that point. If the company is forced to clean up the entire cost, then we don't have a free rider problem. A lot of non-rival public goods fall into this category. Solutions to the problems for free riders can be taxing, okay, soliciting donations, okay, and that's, think of the example we just talked about, like Wikipedia or Patreon if you're into podcasts. Make a public good private, so then you force people to pay something to use it. Okay, and you can think of when they put a paywall up for some sporting events, right? In order for you to watch it in your house, you have to pay for that subscription. Okay, where we see a lot of free rider problems is industrial point source pollution. So point source pollution, and we'll get to this in detail later, but just so we have enough knowledge to understand this fully, is where we can see the pollution occurring. And so I always give the example, and I think it's still fairly relevant. Email me if it's not. When you think back to the Simpsons opening, right, they have that little pipe that comes out when you see the three-eyed fish. That would be a point source. We can go in and see exactly where that pollution is coming from, okay? So one of the problems that we look at is through air pollution. When we look at clean air, okay, it's a public good. We don't pay for it. And so it's difficult to regulate, and so a lot of companies get away with putting pollution into the air and not paying the extent or not paying for that pollution in general. Okay, it's easier for us to get some money or some kind of solution when it's point source. When it's non-point source, then it's really hard to calculate, and that means we can't pinpoint it to a pipe or a smokestack. A good example is when we have agricultural field runoff into water bodies. Okay, we can't necessarily pinpoint exactly where it's coming from, and so then we can't calculate it as well because it's coming from a wider area. If we look at nature services, and we talked about nature services, right? These are things that nature does for us that we currently don't have to pay for, but if we actually calculated it out and had to pay for, it would cost us a lot of money if this stopped. And so a lot of times these are intangible things, so non-monetary assets like human knowledge that doesn't exist physically. A lot of times from an economic standpoint, we would say that nature services are intangible. Human impacts on nature's services are not easily turned around into commodities and are difficult to quantify them in terms of economic terms. So here we have our dung beetle on the screen. They help cycle nutrients in the soil when they bury the dung or carrion. By removing the dung, they prevent populations of parasitic flies from breeding in the fresh species of mammals. They roll and dig a tunnel through the soil, which increases porosity, or the space between our soil particles. We'll talk lots about that when we get to soils, and percolation, so how well water moves through it. Bees we've already talked about in terms of how they help out with pollination. So we can estimate these costs, and I believe I gave you an estimated cost when we first defined nature services with bees. But until we could say potentially they were gone, and then we actually had to do it ourselves, we don't actually know. And so they do become harder to figure out economically what this actually means for us. Okay. If we look at something that's incommensurable, oh my gosh, I'm sorry, incommensurable. In my head, it always comes out, it sounds perfect, then I try to say it out loud, and I stumble all over it. It's on the slide though, I'm so sorry. So basically, these type of goods usually found the intrinsic value, and a lot of times we're going to define them as something that we can't compare to anything else. Okay, if we talk about nature, a lot of features, our grand features, or even our wonders of the world, fall into this category. You can look at the Grand Canyon and not be able to compare it to something else, right? Now, some people look at it and they're like, oh, it's a big hole. If you're more interested in the Grand Canyon than that, and you think about the science behind it and how it formed through fluvial geomorphology in the Colorado River, carving that out, I mean, it's pretty impressive, and it's really not something that has any replica of anywhere else. And so it's really hard to put a value on it. And then we get into this idea of intrinsic value that we already talked about, right? Intrinsically, and even the Grand Canyon is going to have a different value to others. You may not be on the it's the greatest thing you've ever seen end, but you may not be on the it's just a big hole end of the spectrum either. You could be anywhere in between there, and the person next to you could have one thought and one the other. And so if you had to give a monetary value, it would be all over the place. You can even think of like an auction of any type, right? If you go onto eBay, or I'm trying to think like Poshmark or anywhere else where you can kind of like name your own price to a point, right? There's usually a number you're willing to settle on, and if it gets higher than that, you're like, nah, it's not worth it to me. And someone else may pay way more than you, right? And so we can see this idea of beyond instrumental value. It is beyond what we can calculate out in terms of value. So another example that we can look at is the ANWR wilderness site. So that's the area on the north side of Alaska that is under big discussion in terms of should we dig for oil there. Okay, we don't know how much oil is there. We can estimate what we think is there, and so we can try to come up with a value and say, okay, if there's this many barrels of oil and this is how much a barrel of oil is going for, then its value is worth this. Is the potential impact environmentally worth it? Now, some people that don't care about the environmental impact think any oil that's domestic is worth it. People that care about the environment, their value judgment, again, is going to kind of run the gamut there. And so economics, as much as we like to try to impact or have it impact every part of the world, essentially, is really difficult when it comes to nature. And it's very similar to like when we talk about medical things, right? Like how much money, and you can think of this if you have a pet, right? When your pet gets sick, when I go to my vet, you know, I remember when I was first a new patient, I filled out paperwork and it was like I had a couple of options at the bottom, you know, ranging from you have to consult me about everything you do, even in the case of emergency. And then all on the other end, it was in the case of emergency, do anything in your power to save my pet's life. Okay. And in between there were things like do emergency procedures, talk to me about anything elective, like it ran the gamut. And it just kind of falls to where you, I don't want to say value, because that's hard to put a value on your pet, at least for me, but where you want to be when those kind of decisions come up. So we see medical and nature kind of have this same issue where it becomes difficult in some cases to put a cost on what we're looking at. Now, one thing we can do is try to include what we call a societal or environmental cost. Okay, so basically, how do we pay with things? How do we pay for things? How do we deal with issues that are in the environment or reduce free rider problems? So one option is society pays. Basically, federal and state taxes assessed on public to address problems created by residuals such as water pollution. We do this, and this is like our public park system, right? So who's taking care of them? So we can tax through income, property, or on a smaller scale, things like an HOA. If you have, if you live in a neighborhood or an apartment complex, and typically you have an HOA fee if you have like a pool or tennis courts or a playground, or if you have someone within your neighborhood that's going to mow the lawns or is going to shovel the snow for you on common pathways, there's an HOA fee associated sometimes, okay? So we have a lot of different ways that we can get that. The other thing we can do is look at the real cost. So basically, what are we really paying for, okay? We don't often think about this until we see it. So one example where we don't get to see it, and unless you're knowledgeable, you probably don't know, is I don't know what the actual gas I put in my car costs versus how that cost is changed based on fees. One place we can see all these fees is when you buy an airline ticket, right? As soon as you click on that airline ticket, even if it's an airline that says it's like all included, when you get to the checkout, it says this is your Homeland Security fee, this is your booking fee, this is your blah, blah, blah. We also do it with like rental cars. All of a sudden your cost goes way up. Or if you try to buy tickets to a concert, right, all of a sudden you have like all these fees that weren't on the flat base price of your ticket. So sometimes we get these passed on to us and we're either knowledgeable about it or we're not. Typically when we see it, we again make a judgment. Is this worth it to me? Is this not worth it to me based on the new cost? Okay. What can happen as a consumer, especially with an environmental, is any kind of environmental cost that they have to deal with on their end, they can pass on to you. So they'll pay it, but you, by buying that product, are paying it for them, so they're, breaking even essentially on that. Okay, so how can we either support this or not support this? And there's no really incentive for a producer to not pass that on to you if you're willing to pay that price. So one of the ways that you can change that, and this is always how economists say, is you flex your purchasing power, right? By purchasing what you purchase, you are sending a message. And so you can send a message basically in a small way to the producer, okay? Remember, a market efficiency is going to say where prices don't reflect the demand or the supply or what it's worth, and by not purchasing it, then you're creating a market inefficiency, and then they have to change their ways. We can also have what's called a polluter pay model, and that's where the party that's responsible for producing pollution is responsible for paying for the damage. They can do this through a residual tax, which is the amount of income tax you pay for the year minus any tax credits you may have. We have an effluent tax, which is a fee paid by a company to discharge into a sewer. So basically, they know they're going to discharge based on how much they're going to discharge, they're paying that tax. We could have a permit fee or pollution credit, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And a Pigmalion tax is a tax on any market activity that generates negative externalities. It's intended to correct undesirable or inefficient market outcomes. We find that this does in fact work when we have large-scale point source polluters, because again, we have a better idea of where the pollution is coming from. We can put a monitor of whatever kind on that point source, figure out exactly how much is coming out of there, and then be able to address it in that manner. Here's the problem. It's a pollution control strategy, not a pollution prevention strategy. Okay, we'll talk about cap and trade here on the next slide, and we'll see how cap and trade does not necessarily reduce pollution, but kind of shift it around almost. So cap and trade, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it before, but just for a little reminder and refresher, cap and trade are regulations that set a maximum for pollution emissions, but individuals or firms may trade the right to pollute to others. Okay, the system is intended to efficiently reduce emission without excessive cost. So basically, the state determines a regulatory maximum for emissions of an environmental hazard and allows firms to meet the goal themselves or to pay other firms who have been able to reduce their outputs more efficiently for them to do so. It tends to achieve the same results as traditional regulation, but does so at as a lower overall cost. So, example, if we want to reduce our emissions by 300 tons and we have two different companies that are able to reduce at different rates, one company may be able to do it really efficiently. And so while company A may do a tiny bit of reduction, company B, who does more reduction, can basically sell its extra credits that it doesn't need to company A because it may be cheaper for company A to buy extra credits rather than try to pull their emissions down as much as company B did. Okay. We saw cap and trade become a big thing when we were dealing with acidic rain, and we'll talk a lot about acidic rain when we talk about air pollution. It has its positives. A lot of times we can see the reduction overall go down, right? So we're pulling it down, and so if we total up emissions for an entire area, we can see that they meet the standards. However, there are a lot of problems. It does not consider the local effects from concentrated pollution because all it's concerned on is an overall concentration. So company B, for example, locally, their air gets much better, right? Because company B has actually reduced its emissions quite a bit. Company A has maybe reduced a little bit, but they haven't reduced that much. So local pollution near company A still remains high, okay? It does not necessarily address the issue of determining how much pollution should be allowed in the first place. Again, geographically, especially if we're looking on a very large scale, one location is reducing while one is not. We can also see a variation of cap and trade called banking and withdrawing, and this is common to see with wetland protection. Basically, a cap is set on the total amount of wetlands, enforcing no net loss of wetlands overall, but allowing any local loss of wetlands can be offset by the creation of wetlands somewhere else. And so what we can see happen, as an example, if we put a Walmart up in an area where there's wetlands, they have to build some more wetlands, essentially, by a third party. And sometimes what they'll do is if they find a location, they will bank by creating more wetlands than they needed to, so in the future they don't have to come back and create more, okay? And so it's not always helping on the local scale or the smaller scale. On the larger scale, we might see the emissions go down, but there may be very little to no change on a local scale. Other strategies we have are things like a throughput tax, where it's a charge placed on the producer of a good or service to include full cost pricing. We could see a green tax, which are taxes paid by consumers for products or services that are not environmentally friendly. The intended purpose is to offset the negative impact resulting on use of non-green products and services. This is back to that idea of like planting a tree because you are buying a plane ticket or whatever it may be. We could also have a disposal charge or deposit. So it's charged by the seller to the consumer. Sometimes it's also called a recovery charge. This is when you're covering part of the total cost to get rid of something. You typically, if you're disposing of your fridge and old TV correctly, are doing this. Typically, if you get your car battery replaced, you will pay a small fee. If you look at your bill, it's usually like $5 or $10. It's not a ton, but there is a little fee on that because it's a disposal charge. okay? We could look at life cycle costs and life cycle analysis. So basically, what you want to do here is the process of compiling all costs that the owner or producer of an asset incurs over the product's lifespan. So we look at the cost from raw materials through manufacturing and disposal. So we're looking at environmental impacts of extractions of raw materials used to create the good or service, the environmental impacts of manufacturing, the environmental impacts of use, so energy, and the environmental cost of disposal. We have some examples here. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as cradle to grave pricing. And so for this example that's on your slide, we're looking at a company that does carpet interface. A customer returns the used carpet tiles for recycling, and then they reuse it as backing for the new company. They modified their tile design and production methods to reduce waste. They adapted its boilers to use landfill gas for energy. They were able to cut water generation by 80%, fossil fuel use by 45%, and water use by 70%. They ended up saving $30 million per year. Prices were steady and they increased profits by 49%. So a lot of the resistance to this idea is that it's going to be more expensive for manufacturers. But this particular case shows that they were able to do it and actually make profit by taking that into consideration. So we have some models for environmental planning. And so one is a cost-effective analysis. And so basically we're summing all costs and monetary returns involved in implementing a single plan in order to determine the return on investment. Typically it's used for things like health and the environment because it's harder to put a cost on individual steps. Okay. This can be known as a cost-benefit analysis, and it's an approach to estimating the strengths and weaknesses of alternatives used to determine options which provide the best approach to achieving benefits while preserving savings. You're going to compare the costs and benefits of several competing plans at the same time. This is kind of like a shopper in the supermarket analogy. If you are not brand loyal, right, and you walk in and you want to buy, we'll stick with salad dressing. Sorry, I bought some the other day. Italian dressing. If you are not, say, like really in love with Kraft dressing, or who else makes dressing? I can't even think of it. There's a guy with his face on the bottle. I don't know, right? If you are not overly attached, if the Kroger brand or the House brand, whatever it may be, is cheaper that day, that may be what you buy. If Kraft is on sale, you might stock up because you're like, oh, normally this costs a lot more, but here it is on sale, so I'm going to buy it that way. So you have the option when you go in if you are not brand loyal on that specific product. Okay. If we look at an example of this, we can look at Milwaukee's Deep Tunnel Project. And so basically, and we'll come back to this, we'll talk a little more about this a little bit later in the semester. It prevented billions of gallons of pollution from getting into Lake Michigan. It took 10 years to complete, and unfortunately 6 people died in the process. It's blamed by many for repeated sewage dumps into Lake Michigan and basement backups, but it has also been keeping 100 billion gallons of polluted water out of the lake. It's been a driver for economic growth through cleaner rivers. We've expanded it twice, and taxpayers are still paying for the construction. Ideally, they were done by 2017. I believe we may be done at this point. I cannot remember on the date, but it was coming up soon if we haven't already just passed it. Okay, so here we're looking at, do we care more about Lake Michigan and how much pollution is there versus a sewer backup? Now, if your sewer backup was one of them, you're not happy because that's probably one of the most unpleasant things to ever have happen in your house. And if you've had it happen, you know this. However, we're doing this cost-benefit analysis, right? Like, what is more important to you there? We can also look at the idea of things like replacement costs and risk. So one of the first things we can look at is damage cost avoided. So it either uses the value of the property protected or the cost of action taken to avoid damages as a measure of the benefits provided by an ecosystem in this case. So for example, if the wetland protects adjacent property from flooding, the flood protection benefits may be estimated by the damages avoided if the flooding does not occur or the expenditures property owners make to protect their property from flooding. So basically, this is why you insure things, right? This is what insurance is. They estimate the cost of, so when you get renter's insurance or homeowner's insurance, right? Hopefully you have one of the two. You basically estimate how much worth you have in your house. And it can be difficult to do, but you try to pull out a ballpark number. And the insurance company then comes back and says, okay, based on how much money is potentially in your house, let's say if you lose your stuff to fire, this is how much you pay us each month. Renter's insurance tends to be a lot cheaper than homeowner's insurance, but you are paying every month regardless if something happens or not, right? In a lot of cases, most people think that's the smart thing to do, right? It's better to be protected than all of a sudden lose all of your stuff and potentially need to pay that money out of pocket right away. So that's kind of how damage cost avoided works. Replacement cost uses the cost of replacing an ecosystem or its services as an estimate of an ecosystem or service. In the example I gave you with homeowners insurance and renters insurance, those are very closely related. So it's a little bit, in general, they're pretty related. If we're looking environmentally, there's slightly difference based on those two definitions. A substitute cost is, it uses the cost of a provided substitute for an ecosystem or its services as an estimate of the value of an ecosystem or its services. So if we use the flooding example again, here, what do we have to, what's the cost of replacing or substituting the wetland with a retaining wall or levee? And so we could say, oh, well, if we don't have the wetland to help protect from flooding, what's the cost of the levee? That would be a substitute to help protection. All three of these, again, are related to estimate values of ecosystem services based on either the cost of avoiding damage lost to service, replacing that ecosystem service, or the cost of a substitute service. They're not perfect, certainly, right? Just like insurance is not necessarily perfect. Everything will not be covered, and there's a lot of reasons for that when we look at insurance, but you're not always getting the exact value back. But they give us a rough indicator of economic value. And for the environment, as we said, that's a good thing if we really want to try to put a number on the environment, because otherwise it's very difficult in order to do. They're not strict measurements of economic values, but they assume the cost of, again, avoiding damages or replacing ecosystem services that may be harmed. Okay, it's based on an idea that if people incur costs to avoid damage caused by lost ecosystem services, those services must be worth at least what people paid to replace them. So if we look at an oil spill, and the particular one I have here is the Zoe Calcatorni oil spill that happened off the coast of Puerto Rico. When they went to court to calculate the cost of the lower trophic organisms killed, and then added up the cost of purchasing these organisms from a catalog. And they were basically saying, that's how much we'll pay for our oil spill. We'll pay for whatever cost it is to buy these organisms from a catalog and put them back into the water. Okay, the court says no, that was not actually okay, because they weren't actually going to replace them with the organisms purchased. In the time that it would have taken them to buy them and get them back into the water, in this particular case, the organisms would have replaced themselves. So basically they were like, you're not paying to replace them. That's not an equal trade-off there. And again, this was because they were looking at lower trophic organisms. Obviously, the higher trophic we got, they wouldn't be able to replace themselves as quickly. Anytime we're looking at economics, we have to deal with risk and uncertainty. Okay, risk is the probability of a negative event. We could also say it's the likelihood of an event occurring. We could be looking at magnitude. So when we look at magnitude, it's more that we have something that's a common occurrence, but the strength of that occurrence varies. So if we think about places that are in an area that experiences hurricanes on a regular basis, how often are those hurricanes catastrophic versus just getting one? Because that's the expectation. And it's kind of like living here with snow, right? Every winter we have the chance of getting snow, right? Every once in a while we get those big snowstorms that maybe, cause roads to close for an extended period of time. We lose power, we lose schools, whatever that may be for an extended period of time. But that's not the norm. So there we look more at risk of magnitude. Uncertainty is going to be any situation that we're not completely sure about or can be the margin of error. Inherent variability is the ordinary variability in a system, such as randomness. When we don't have knowledge of an uncertainty, that typically means there's a lack of understanding in the events or processes. This is where the precautionary principle can come into play. If we don't know enough about something and don't feel confident on what the outcome should be, should we use the precautionary principle or not? And remember, that's the better safe than sorry type principle. Other strategies we can use for measuring environmental costs are things like willingness to pay, proxy value, and shadow pricing. So willingness to pay, ask the consumers what they are willing to pay for a change in good or service. Something costs more, are you willing to pay for it, or do you donate to a particular cause because you feel strongly about it, even if you don't take advantage of it? So, are you willing to pay for organic over regular because organic is important to you, because it tends to be more expensive. That's not always the case. Are you willing to pay for that? Are you willing to pay more for a cleaner because it's environmentally friendly versus one that's not? So we make this decision every time we purchase something. Okay, proxy value. This is the value that's sometimes estimated by the total cost of everything. So a good example here is hunting. So the value could be determined by the cost of the equipment, your hunting license, the time off of work, your travel expenses. Here you're adding something up to get a total. Another really great example of this is like a wedding, right? So weddings are always way more expensive just even to attend than you normally think, because all of a sudden, especially if you're taking part or if it's a destination of some sort, somewhere where you don't live, you're paying for flights, you're paying for a hotel, you might have a rental car, you might have a gift. If you're in the wedding, you might have certain attire that, or makeup or hair or shoes or ties or whatever it may be. And all of a sudden, something that seemed like it shouldn't be that expensive for you just to attend becomes much more expensive if you really look at the whole value. Now, in some cases, depending on who's getting married, that doesn't bother you and you actually don't even think about those added costs. In other cases, if maybe you're not as close with the people, you're like, ooh, is this really worth it? That's a lot. And that's what proxy value would be. Shadow pricing is commonly referred to as a monetary value assigned to currently unknowable or difficult to calculate costs. We use it in a cost-benefit analysis where we can't quantify an item by a market price. It also typically is the maximum price that a business should be willing to pay for that. So it's almost your maximum value that you're willing. So again, if you think back to that auction, like where's your stopping point? The value may not be that, or if it's intrinsic, you might be willing to spend more than market value, but there's going to be a point where you don't want to go past. So other barriers that we have in our decision-making processes are things like the discount rate, the rate at which society as a whole is willing to trade off present and future benefits, a time preference, how quickly do you want to see your return on investment? So sometimes when you go shopping, you look at something and you're like, okay, so for instance, recently I've been looking at a laser printer and they are more expensive than your standard printer. And so I looked at basically how many pages they print, right? How expensive the toner cartridge is, and then compared it to the sheets I get from my regular printer. And so how quickly would it pay for itself essentially or become even? And so you could look at that time preference, or people buy jeans and they're like, I wear jeans a lot. I'm willing to pay more for them because my time preference or my rate of wear per cost is much lower than buying like a fancy dress or a suit where you may not wear it as much and it's more expensive. So you may look at cost that way. And then lastly, we can look at opportunity cost. It's the expected final return foregone by investing in a project rather than comparable financial securities. Let's talk about Jevons paradox. It's one of the most widely known paradoxes in environmental economics. So in 1865, an observation of William Jevons observed that an increase in the efficiency of using coal to produce energy tended to increase consumption rather than decrease it. This seems strange because if it was more efficient, you should use less. However, he argued the cheaper the price of coal-produced energy encouraged people to find more innovative ways, basically, to use coal in that way. What we can see happens is the gains from energy and efficiency then become lost because people's consumption rises in response to lower costs. So we may not actually have any kind of environmental savings at all. And I will tell you, I saw this when I first started driving. When I started driving, gas was below $1 a gallon. And I probably did a lot more driving because gas was so cheap, because as a 16-year-old, it was boring. There wasn't a lot to do. And so what we would do is we would drive and explore different neighborhoods of the city that we didn't live in. And so I did more driving then than I did later because gas was cheap. When gas was more expensive, I felt like filling up every time. I noticed more, so then I didn't do as much driving because I didn't want to be filling up as much. What happens a lot of times is that if we make something efficient, basically the price goes down. And typically when the price goes down, we're more likely to purchase it. And you can also think about this if you go to the grocery store. If something is on sale that you really enjoy, sometimes it's hard to fight the inclination to buy a lot of them. Now, in some cases, this is not going to be a big deal because it may last a long time. But if it's something that's perishable and you just get overly excited, like, for example, like yogurt or something that doesn't have a huge shelf life, you may not actually end up getting to use it. And so even though it was cheaper, if you don't get to it before it goes bad, then you've essentially wasted that money because you need to throw it out so you don't get sick. So efficiency does not always show us the positive outcome we want, because efficiency may drop the price enough that we actually just use more, and so we can balance that out or even start to see consumption go up. So with environmental economics, the problem is it's really hard to put the value on some of these services or ecosystems because we don't know what the real cost is until it's gone, and we then have to somehow come up with it. So to estimate that cost, as we talked about, we have a couple different options, but that's not going to be perfect, right? And so we need to try to get a value on resources as much as possible. We need to find social systems that are going to allocate resources appropriately and that we feel comfortable with. And so when we're making policy, keep this in mind. That's part of what goes into policy and what makes things worth doing or not doing when it comes to the environment. And so we'll see reflections based on who's potentially making that policy, how that's going to shake out for us in the end.